Christopher Reed had spent years dreaming of owning a home where he could finally find some peace. As a retired Marine turned small business owner, he had faced his share of battles on the field and in life. His tireless work running a successful auto repair shop had finally paid off, allowing him to purchase a sprawling property on the edge of a quiet, forested suburb. For Christopher, this wasn't just a house. It was his sanctuary, a place to heal, reflect, and start fresh. The property was perfect, a modest, well-built home nestled amidst towering trees, offering solitude and a much-needed reprieve from the chaos of urban life. The sprawling backyard, framed by a sturdy wooden fence, had been the highlight for Christopher. It was where he planned to start a vegetable garden, set up a fire pit for cool evenings, and even build a small workshop for personal projects. After years of constant movement, he was finally ready to put down roots. But the first sign of trouble came sooner than expected. It was late afternoon on a warm spring day when Christopher noticed something unusual. He had just returned home from the shop and was unloading groceries when he heard the faint rumble of machinery. The sound was too close for comfort, coming from the far end of his backyard. At first he dismissed it, thinking it might be someone working on a neighboring property. But as he stepped out onto his patio to investigate, he froze. Near the edge of his property, just beyond the fence line, there were workers in orange vests. A bulldozer idled nearby as men moved heavy equipment around what looked like the beginnings of a concrete foundation. Christopher's confusion quickly turned to anger. No one had informed him of any construction nearby, let alone on his property. He hurried down the steps, crossed the yard, and approached the fence. "Hey," he called out, his voice sharp and commanding. "What's going on here? This is private property." The workers barely glanced at him. One of them, a burly man with a clipboard, finally turned to face him. "We're with the HOA," he said, his tone dismissive. "This is authorized work. You'll need to take it up with them." Christopher's jaw tightened. "Authorized by who? This is my land? I didn't approve anything." The man didn't bother to reply. Instead, he turned back to the workers and barked an order for them to keep going. Christopher's protests were ignored, and as the sound of the machinery grew louder, he realized he wasn't going to get answers from the crew. That evening, as the noise of construction finally died down, Christopher sat at his kitchen table, staring at the unopened envelope that had been sitting on his counter for days. It bore the unmistakable logo of the Homeowners Association, something he had brushed off as junk mail when it arrived. With a sinking feeling in his gut, he tore it open. The letter inside was curt and bureaucratic, laden with legal jargon. The HOA had apparently authorized the construction of a helicopter landing pad at the far edge of Christopher's property. The pad, the letter stated, was intended for use by HOA board members and their high-priority guests. What truly made his blood boil was the final paragraph. Christopher was being informed that he would be financially responsible for the upkeep of the helipad, as it was now considered part of his property. He read the letter twice, hoping he had misunderstood, but the words didn't change. How was this even possible? Christopher had meticulously reviewed every document when he purchased the house, ensuring there were no outstanding HOA-related obligations. Yet, the letter claimed the construction was authorized under an amendment to his deed, a document he had never seen. The next morning, Christopher drove to the HOA office, his mind racing with questions. The building, a modern but unassuming structure in a nearby strip mall, seemed at odds with the shadowy bureaucracy it represented. As he walked through the glass doors, he was met with the cold, perfunctory gaze of the receptionist. "I'm here to speak to someone about unauthorized construction on my property," Christopher said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Do you have an appointment?" the receptionist asked without looking up from her computer. "No, but then I'm afraid I can't help you." Christopher's patience snapped. "I'll wait." After nearly an hour, he was finally ushered into a small conference room where he was greeted by Martin Sloan, the HOA president. Sloan was a sharp-dressed man in his 50s, with an air of smug confidence that immediately set Christopher on edge. "What seems to be the problem, Mr. Reed?" Sloan asked, though the smirk on his face suggested he already knew. Christopher laid the letter on the table. "You're building a helipad on my property without my consent. I want it stopped immediately." Sloan took his time reading the letter, then leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Reed, everything we're doing is within the bounds of the HOA's authority. The helipad was approved by the board and falls under the amended bylaws." "What amendment?" Christopher demanded. "I never agreed to this." Sloan raised an eyebrow. "The amendment was filed after you purchased the property. All property owners in the community are subject to the HOA's decisions, as outlined in the original deed. I suggest you review the bylaws if you have any doubts." Christopher clenched his fists, struggling to keep his temper in check. "This is my land. You can't just take it." Sloan's smile widened. "Mr. Reed, I assure you we're acting entirely within our rights. And as the owner of the property, you'll find that the maintenance fees for the helipad are now your responsibility." The meeting ended with Christopher storming out of the office, his anger barely contained. That night, as he sat in his living room, staring at the letter again, he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just a case of bureaucratic overreach, it was theft, plain and simple. And if the HOA thought he would roll over and accept it, they were in for a fight. The morning after his confrontation with Martin Sloan, Christopher woke up with a gnawing sense of dread. He had spent the entire night poring over the documents he had received when he purchased the property, determined to find some explanation for how the HOA had managed to hijack his land. The deed was clear. The property belonged entirely to him, with no mention of any shared rights or easements that would allow something as ludicrous as a helipad to be built. Yet the HOA had brazenly claimed otherwise, and Christopher knew from Sloan's smugness that they weren't bluffing. He decided he needed to take immediate action. His first step was to consult a real estate attorney, hoping to confirm that the HOA's claims were baseless. A quick online search led him to Lisa Moreno, a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes and had an impressive track record of defending homeowners against overreach. By mid-morning, Christopher was sitting in Lisa's sleek downtown office, a folder of documents in hand, and a grim expression on his face. Lisa listened intently as Christopher explained the situation, her sharp, professional demeanor giving him a flicker of hope. When he finished, she took the folder and began flipping through the papers. "You did everything right during the purchase," she said after a moment. "You reviewed the original deed, verified there were no outstanding lines, and confirmed the HOA's boundaries. None of this should be happening. But..." Christopher tensed. "But what?" She frowned, holding up a copy of the HOA's bylaws that had been included in the purchase paperwork. "These bylaws were updated 6 months after you bought the property. According to this clause, the HOA claims the right to reallocate common use areas in cases where it benefits the community. They're arguing that the helipad falls under this provision." Christopher stared at her in disbelief. "But that's insane. They can't just decide to take my land. It's not a common use area. It's my backyard." Lisa nodded. "I agree. But HOAs are notorious for pushing the boundaries of what's legal. If they filed this amendment properly and had it approved by the board, it might be enough to give them a flimsy legal cover." She paused, flipping to another page. "I'll need to check if they followed the correct procedures when they passed this amendment. If they didn't, we have a strong case to challenge it. Can you stop the construction in the meantime?" Christopher asked. Lisa hesitated. "That's tricky. HOAs tend to move fast when they know they're on shaky ground. By the time we file an injunction, they could already have the helipad finished. That's likely part of their strategy, make it harder for you to reverse the damage." Christopher clenched his fists. "So what am I supposed to do? Just let them build it?" "Not exactly," Lisa said. "I'll start digging into their filings and looking for any procedural errors. In the meantime, document everything. Photos, videos, written records of every interaction, especially with the workers on your property. If this goes to court, we'll need every piece of evidence we can get." Christopher left Lisa's office feeling marginally better, but the weight of the situation still bore down on him. He drove home, his mind racing with possibilities. If the HOA really thought they could get away with this, they must have done it before. Maybe his neighbors had faced similar issues. The thought gave him an idea. He needed to start talking to people in the community. That afternoon, Christopher knocked on the door of his nearest neighbor, an elderly woman named Marjorie who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. She welcomed him inside with a warm smile, but her face darkened when he mentioned the helipad. "Oh, Christopher," she said, shaking her head. You've stirred up the hornet's nest now." "What do you mean?" he asked, leaning forward. Marjorie sighed. "The HOA has been doing things like this for years. They call it community improvement, but really it's just about power and money. They find ways to take little bits of people's property, just enough that it doesn't seem worth fighting over. And then they turn around and sell it, or lease it to someone else. Most folks don't have the time or resources to push back, so they let it go." Christopher's stomach turned. "And no one's ever stopped them?" "Not yet," Marjorie said. "A few people tried, but it never went anywhere. The HOA always finds a way to shut them down. Either they drown you in legal fees, or they start hitting you with fines for the smallest things. Your grass is too long. Your trash can isn't in the right spot. It's easier to give up." Christopher left Marjorie's house with a growing sense of unease. If the HOA had a history of bullying residents, they likely thought he would be no different. But Christopher wasn't the kind of man to back down from a fight. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than simple greed. The speed and brazenness of the construction, the vague language in the bylaws, something didn't add up. That evening, as he was reviewing his notes and photos, Christopher's phone buzzed. It was Lisa. "I've found something," she said without preamble. "The amendment they're using to justify the helipad. It was filed with the county clerk's office, but the signatures on it look off. One of the board members listed as approving it hasn't been active in the HOA for years. I'm going to need some time to confirm this, but if I'm right, the entire amendment could be fraudulent." Christopher's pulse quickened. "What does that mean?" "It means they might have forged the document to give themselves the authority to take your land," Lisa said. "If we can prove that, it's not just a civil matter, it's criminal." The idea that the HOA could be resorting to outright fraud was both infuriating and deeply unsettling. If they were willing to go that far, how much worse could this get? The next day, Christopher woke to the sound of heavy machinery once again. He walked out to his backyard to find that the workers had made significant progress overnight. The outline of the helipad was now unmistakable, a massive circle of concrete dominating what had once been a peaceful stretch of grass. The sight filled him with a cold fury. As he approached the fence, one of the workers, a younger man with a nervous expression, paused and glanced in his direction. Christopher seized the moment. "You know this is illegal, right?" he called out. "They don't have the right to build here." The man hesitated, then muttered, "I just do what I'm told." Christopher's anger boiled over. Told by who? The HOA? They're breaking the law, and you're helping them do it. Before the worker could respond, the foreman barked an order for him to get back to work. Christopher stood there, fuming, as the machinery roared back to life. That night, as he sat in his living room, Christopher heard a loud knock at the door. When he opened it, he found an envelope taped to the frame. Inside was another letter from the HOA, this one even more infuriating than the last. It accused him of obstructing community development and threatened fines of up to $5,000 if he didn't cease disruptive behavior immediately. Christopher stared at the letter, his hands trembling with rage. The message was clear. The HOA wasn't just trying to take his land, they were trying to break him. And if they thought he would roll over and let them win, they were dead wrong. The next few days were a blur of noise, dust, and frustration for Christopher. The construction of the helipad moved forward at a breakneck pace, and it seemed as though the workers were actively trying to antagonize him. Trucks rumbled through the neighborhood at all hours, tearing up the narrow streets and leaving behind a trail of dirt and debris. The clanging of metal and the grating hum of machinery filled the air from early morning until late at night. Every time Christopher tried to address the workers or demand answers, they either ignored him or curtly pointed him back to the HOA. Despite Lisa's assurances that she was building a solid legal case, Christopher felt like he was running out of time. The helipad was nearly complete, and he feared that once it was operational, the HOA would double down on their claims, making it even harder to remove. Worse, he noticed that several of his neighbors who had previously been polite, if distant, now seemed to avoid him. Some wouldn't even make eye contact when he waved from his driveway. It wasn't long before he found out why. Late one afternoon, as he walked to his mailbox, Christopher overheard two women from down the street whispering near the corner. "He's just causing trouble," one of them said. Loud enough for him to hear. It's bad enough they're building that thing, but now he's making it worse for everyone. HOA fees are going to go up because of him. Christopher's chest tightened with anger, but he kept walking, pretending he hadn't heard. When he opened his mailbox, he found yet another letter from the HOA. This one was different, printed on heavy, watermarked paper with bold, intimidating language. It accused him of failing to uphold community standards and interfering with approved projects vital to neighborhood development. Along with the letter was a notice of fines totaling $2,500, allegedly for violations such as obstruction of HOA processes and failure to maintain property integrity. The absurdity of the accusations was almost laughable. Christopher's property was immaculate, his yard well kept, and his trash bins always stored away on time. The fines were nothing more than a blatant attempt to intimidate him. He called Lisa immediately and read the letter aloud. "They're trying to bleed you dry," Lisa said, her voice tense. "This is classic HOA retaliation. They're piling on bogus fines to pressure you into backing off. If you pay, it's as good as admitting fault, and if you don't, they'll use it as a pretext to escalate further." "So what do I do?" Christopher asked, his frustration mounting. "Don't pay," Lisa replied firmly. "We'll fight this along with the Helipad. But you need to document everything. Take photos of your property, keep track of every interaction, and save every letter they send. The more evidence we have, the stronger your case." Christopher hung up, trying to shake off the feeling of helplessness that had settled over him. He spent the rest of the day photographing his yard and organizing the growing stack of HOA correspondence. That evening, he decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, hoping to clear his head and maybe gauge how others felt about the situation. As he strolled past the rows of neatly maintained homes, he noticed that several houses had the same distinctively printed HOA notices taped to their doors or mailboxes. Some had even more than one. A sinking realization hit him: he wasn't the only one being targeted. The HOA was systematically going after multiple homeowners, likely for reasons that suited their agenda. One house in particular caught his attention. It belonged to an older couple, the Johnsons, who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. Christopher had always admired their beautifully landscaped front yard, but now it was overgrown and neglected. A large for sale sign stood in the driveway, and the windows were dark. Curious, Christopher knocked on the door of the house next to the Johnsons. A man in his 40s answered, looking wary. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone cautious. "I'm Chris Reed," he said. "I live a few houses down. I was just wondering what happened to the Johnsons. I noticed their place is for sale." The man hesitated, glancing over his shoulder before stepping outside and lowering his voice. "The HOA drove them out," he said grimly. "They hit them with fines for every little thing. Grass was too long, paint on the shutters was faded, you name it. They couldn't keep up, and eventually the HOA foreclosed on them, took their house and sold it to some investor." Christopher felt a chill run down his spine. "Foreclosed? Over fines?" The man nodded. "They can do that, apparently. It's all in the bylaws. The Johnsons tried to fight it, but they didn't have the money or the energy. It's happening to more and more people around here. You're not the first, and you won't be the last." As Christopher walked home, the man's words echoed in his mind. The HOA wasn't just overreaching, they were systematically preying on homeowners, using fines and legal loopholes to force people out. He began to wonder if the Helipad was just the tip of the iceberg. The next morning, Christopher woke to find his front yard littered with trash, crumpled fast food wrappers, empty cans, and even a few shredded HOA notices. Someone had clearly dumped it there on purpose. Furious, he called the HOA office to report the vandalism, but the receptionist barely concealed her indifference. "We don't handle individual complaints," she said curtly. "You can submit a formal request at the next board meeting." Christopher hung up, his anger boiling over. He spent the rest of the day cleaning up the mess and installing security cameras around his property. That evening, as he reviewed the footage from earlier in the day, he caught a glimpse of a figure walking down the street in the early hours of the morning. The person was wearing a hoodie, their face obscured, but they paused briefly in front of Christopher's house before walking away. Christopher's phone buzzed. It was a text from Lisa. "I've been reviewing the signatures on the amendment again," she wrote. "One of the names belongs to someone who died 2 years ago. This is major. Call me tomorrow." The message gave Christopher a much-needed surge of hope. If Lisa could prove the amendment was fraudulent, it could invalidate everything the HOA had done. But as he prepared for bed, a sense of unease lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that the HOA was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. That night, Christopher was jolted awake by the sound of tires screeching outside. He ran to the window and saw a pickup truck speeding away, its taillights vanishing into the darkness. When he stepped outside, he found his mailbox smashed to pieces, its contents scattered across the lawn. Among the debris was another letter from the HOA, folded neatly and left on his doorstep. The message was short and chilling: "Back off while you still can." Christopher sat at his kitchen table, staring at the HOA's latest threat. The words "back off while you still can" burned into his mind. His frustration was giving way to something darker, a deep, simmering anger. He had fought through worse in his life, and he wasn't going to let a group of bureaucratic bullies take what was his. But as the sound of construction echoed from the back of his property, he couldn't deny the stakes were rising. The helipad was nearing completion, and he was running out of time to stop it. Lisa's text about the dead HOA board member provided a glimmer of hope, and Christopher called her first thing in the morning. She sounded sharper than usual, the excitement in her voice evident. "I went through the signatures on the amendment, and one of them belongs to a man named Carl Denton. According to public records, Denton passed away 2 years before this amendment was filed." Christopher was silent for a moment, absorbing the implications. "So they forged his signature?" "That's what it looks like," Lisa replied. "If we can prove this, it could invalidate the entire amendment. It would also open the door to criminal charges for fraud. But here's the problem: the HOA will fight tooth and nail to argue that it was an administrative oversight, or that someone else acted on Denton's behalf. We need more than just this signature, we need a pattern of misconduct." "How do we find that?" Christopher asked. "I'm already working on it," Lisa said. "But I need time. I've filed requests for HOA records with the county clerk's office, and I'm looking into past complaints against them. In the meantime, keep documenting everything on your end. If they're trying to intimidate you, it means you're getting under their skin." Christopher hung up, his resolve hardening. He spent the day checking his security cameras, repositioning them for better coverage of his property. The footage from the previous night showed nothing but the blurry outline of the truck that had destroyed his mailbox, but it was enough to confirm what he already knew. The HOA, or someone working on their behalf, was willing to escalate. The next day, Christopher received an unexpected knock on his door. It was Marjorie, his elderly neighbor. She held a plate of cookies, but her expression was strained. "I thought you could use a little kindness," she said, stepping inside. Christopher offered her a seat at the table and poured her a cup of coffee. Marjorie sat in silence for a moment, then finally spoke. "You should know, I heard from one of the other neighbors that the HOA is holding a closed meeting tonight. They're saying it's to discuss community concerns, but I think it's about you." Christopher frowned. "How do you know that?" Marjorie hesitated. "Because they've done it before. When my husband was still alive, we tried to fight them on a zoning issue. They held one of these closed meetings, and not long after, we started getting fines for things we'd never been warned about. They find ways to wear you down." "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" Christopher asked, his voice tight. Marjorie looked down, her hands trembling slightly. "Because I'm afraid. I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years, and I've seen what they can do to people who cross them. You're a strong man, Christopher, but even strong men can't fight a system like this alone." Christopher clenched his fists under the table, his anger bubbling to the surface. "Thank you for telling me," he said finally. "But I'm not giving up. Not on this." After Marjorie left, Christopher decided he needed to get more information about the meeting. If the HOA was planning something against him, he couldn't afford to be in the dark. He called Lisa and explained what Marjorie had told him. "They're probably covering their tracks," Lisa said. "If they know we're looking into the amendment, they'll try to strengthen their position. Closed meetings are a classic tactic to keep homeowners like you out of the loop." "So what do we do?" Christopher asked. "I'll handle the legal side, Lisa replied. "But if you can get any information from other neighbors or find out what they're discussing, it could help. Just be careful, they're clearly not above intimidation." That evening, as the HOA meeting took place in the community center, Christopher sat in his truck across the street, watching the parking lot. He recognized several board members as they arrived, including Martin Sloan. The smug president was dressed in an expensive suit, his confidence radiating as he greeted other members with firm handshakes. Christopher felt a surge of frustration. These people were plotting to take his property, to bully and intimidate him, all while pretending to represent the best interests of the neighborhood. He wanted to march in and confront them, but he knew it wouldn't accomplish anything. Instead, he took out his phone and began making notes, the time of the meeting, the attendees, and anything else that might be useful later. The next day, Christopher received a call from Lisa. She sounded excited. "I just got the HOA's financial records from the last 2 years. There's something big here, Chris. They've been funneling money from community improvement fees into a private account linked to Martin Sloan. I think he's been using the HOA as a personal cash cow." Christopher's jaw tightened. "How does that help us with the helipad?" "It connects the dots," Lisa said. "The money in that account was used to pay the contractors building the helipad. If we can prove Sloan is using HOA funds for his own benefit, it undermines everything they're doing. It's not just a legal violation, it's corruption." Christopher felt a flicker of hope for the first time in days. "What's the next step?" "I'm filing a formal complaint with the state's HOA Oversight Board," Lisa said. "But it could take weeks for them to act. In the meantime, I need you to keep documenting everything happening on your property. If we can show that Sloan is targeting you specifically, it strengthens our case." Over the next few days, Christopher threw himself into gathering evidence. He photographed the nearly completed helipad, recorded the noise from the construction site, and kept a detailed log of every interaction he had with the workers and the HOA. But the harassment continued. One morning, Christopher woke to find that someone had spray-painted "Traitor" in bright red letters across his garage door. It was a clear attempt to intimidate him, but it only strengthened his resolve. He filed a police report and sent the photos to Lisa, who added them to their growing case against the HOA. But the most shocking revelation came a few nights later. As Christopher reviewed his security camera footage, he noticed something strange. One of the workers from the helipad site was carrying a large metal box into the wooded area behind his property. Curious, Christopher grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate. In the darkness, he found the box partially buried under a pile of leaves. Inside were papers, blueprints for the helipad, invoices from the contractors, and a handwritten note addressed to Martin Sloan. The note was brief but damning. "The shipment will arrive once the helipad is operational. Make sure the paperwork is in order." Christopher's heart raced as he realized the implications. This wasn't just about a helipad or HOA overreach. Sloan was using the helipad for something far bigger and far more dangerous than anyone had suspected. He immediately sent photos of the documents to Lisa, who was stunned. "Chris, this changes everything," she said. "This isn't just fraud or intimidation. If we can tie this to illegal activity, it could blow the whole case wide open." But Christopher knew one thing for certain. Whatever Sloan was planning, he had to stop it before it was too late. Christopher couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him since discovering the box of damning documents behind his property. The implications of what he had found were staggering. Martin Sloan and the HOA weren't just engaging in fraud and intimidation. They were orchestrating something far more sinister. The cryptic note about a shipment arriving after the helipad became operational gnawed at him. What were they planning to transport? Who was involved? And most importantly, how far were they willing to go to protect their scheme? Lisa was quick to act on the discovery. After carefully reviewing the blueprints, invoices, and the note, she filed a new complaint with the State HOA Oversight Board, this time citing evidence of potential illegal activity. But as she explained to Christopher, the wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly. "We've got enough to raise alarms," she said during a tense phone call. "But if we want real action, we need to figure out exactly what they're moving through that helipad. Until we do, this is just speculation and the HOA knows it." That same evening, Christopher's tension deepened when he received another letter from the HOA. This one wasn't just a notice of fines, it was a formal legal warning, accusing him of interference with HOA operations and threatening a lawsuit. The letter claimed he had been trespassing on HOA-managed property, likely referring to his discovery of the buried box, and demanded that he cease any unauthorized actions immediately. The message was clear. The HOA was trying to scare him into silence. But Christopher had faced worse threats in his life, and he wasn't about to back down. He spent the next few days reviewing every piece of evidence he had collected so far, but the deeper he looked, the more questions arose. Why had Sloan chosen his property for the helipad? Was it just a matter of convenience? Or was there something about his land that made it critical to their operation? His answer came sooner than expected. Early one morning, as he sat on his back porch with a cup of coffee, Christopher noticed movement near the edge of his property. A group of workers had returned to the helipad site, but they weren't just finishing construction, they were installing what looked like heavy-duty security cameras around the area. The sight sent a chill down his spine. Why would a neighborhood HOA need such high-grade surveillance for a community project? That afternoon, he called Lisa to update her. "They're setting up cameras around the helipad," he said. "This isn't normal. Whatever they're doing, they don't want anyone to see it." Lisa sighed heavily on the other end of the line. "This just keeps getting worse. I filed everything I can with the state board, but if they're doubling down like this, it means they're confident we won't stop them in time. We need leverage, something that'll force them to back off before this escalates further." "Leverage?" Christopher asked. "What kind of leverage?" "Evidence," Lisa said. "Hard evidence. If we can figure out what they're planning to use the helipad for, drugs, weapons, whatever it is, we can bypass the HOA board entirely and go straight to law enforcement. But until then, we're stuck playing their game." Christopher felt his stomach tighten. He had already risked enough by investigating on his own, but Lisa was right. If they couldn't uncover the full scope of the operation, Sloan and the HOA would continue to steamroll over him and anyone else who got in their way. That night, Christopher decided to take matters into his own hands. Armed with a flashlight and his phone, he crept toward the helipad under cover of darkness. The construction site was quiet, but the new cameras loomed overhead, their lenses glinting in the moonlight. Staying out of their line of sight, he made his way toward the storage container that the workers had been using as a makeshift office. Inside, he found stacks of paperwork, most of it routine invoices and supply orders. But buried beneath the pile was a manifest labeled incoming shipments. The document listed several items marked sensitive, with vague descriptions like specialized equipment and materials for secure transport. At the bottom of the page, a delivery date was circled in red, less than a week away. Before he could take more photos, Christopher heard the crunch of gravel behind him. He froze, heart pounding, as the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. Ducking behind a stack of crates, he held his breath, praying he hadn't been seen. The footsteps stopped just outside the container, and he could hear muffled voices, two men, their tone tense and hurried. "You think Sloan knows about the delays?" one of them asked. "He's pissed," the other replied. "If we don't have everything ready by the end of the week, it's our asses. Just keep your mouth shut and do your job." The voices faded as the men moved away, but Christopher stayed hidden for several more minutes, waiting until he was sure the coast was clear. When he finally slipped back to his house, his mind was racing. Whatever Sloan was planning, it was happening soon, and the stakes were higher than he had realized. The next morning, Christopher shared everything he had found with Lisa. "This is big," she said after a long pause. "The delivery date gives us a timeline, but we still don't know what they're transporting. If it's something illegal, we need proof before we can bring it to the authorities." "What about those guys I overheard?" Christopher asked. "Can we use that against them?" "Not without more context," Lisa said. "It's suspicious, but it's not enough. We need something concrete." Over the next few days, the pressure mounted. The HOA continued to bombard Christopher with fines and legal threats, but it was clear they were also feeling the heat. Sloan himself showed up at the helipad site twice, barking orders at the workers and pacing back and forth like a man on the edge. Then, just 2 days before the delivery date, Christopher received an unexpected visit. A man in a crisp suit appeared at his door, introducing himself as a representative of the HOA. He claimed to be there to discuss a resolution, but quickly made it clear he was there to intimidate. "We understand you've been causing some issues, Mr. Reed," the man said, his smile cold and calculated. "The HOA is willing to overlook your disruptions, provided you agree to drop any legal action and allow the project to proceed without further interference." "And if I don't?" Christopher asked, his voice icy. The man's smile didn't falter. "Then I'm afraid things will become unpleasant for everyone involved." Christopher slammed the door in his face. The encounter only strengthened his resolve. That night, as the final preparations for the helipad continued, Christopher made a decision. If the shipment was arriving in 2 days, he needed to be ready. With Lisa's help, he began coordinating with a private investigator she had worked with before, someone who could help them uncover the truth about what Sloan and the HOA were hiding. The clock was ticking, and Christopher knew one thing for certain: whatever was coming, he would be ready to fight. The night before the scheduled delivery, Christopher couldn't sleep. The documents he had uncovered and the veiled threats from the HOA representatives swirled in his mind. It wasn't just about his land anymore. The helipad was part of something far more dangerous. Every instinct from his military days told him that whatever Sloan and the HOA were orchestrating, it wasn't just illegal, it was risky enough for them to escalate their intimidation tactics to keep him silent. But Christopher wasn't about to back down. Lisa had been working tirelessly in the background, coordinating with a private investigator named Garrett Chase. Garrett had decades of experience exposing shady operations like this, and the moment Lisa had shared the shipment manifest and the note, he had agreed to take the case. That evening, Garrett met Christopher at his home. A rugged man in his late 40s with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, Garrett wasted no time laying out their plan. "The shipment's supposed to arrive sometime tomorrow," Garrett said, spreading out a map of Christopher's property and the surrounding area on the kitchen table. "If they're using the helipad for transport, we need to see exactly what's being offloaded and where it's going. I've got a high-range camera and some surveillance gear we can set up along the perimeter. With the cameras you already have, we should get a pretty clear picture of what they're up to." Christopher nodded, his jaw tight. "And if we see something illegal? Then we call it in," Garrett said. "Not the HOA board, not the state oversight board, straight to law enforcement. If this is what I think it is, we're talking federal-level jurisdiction, but we need solid evidence first. No speculation." They spent the next several hours setting up the equipment. Garrett placed cameras at strategic points along the property line, carefully avoiding the newly installed surveillance around the helipad. By midnight, everything was in place, and Christopher returned to his house, feeling both anxious and determined. Whatever happened tomorrow, he was ready. The following day, Christopher kept a low profile. He watched from his kitchen window as the workers completed the final touches on the helipad. By late afternoon, the activity around the site began to ramp up. Several unmarked trucks arrived, their drivers speaking in hushed tones with the foreman. Christopher noticed Martin Sloan arrive shortly after, his demeanor tense and agitated as he gestured emphatically toward the trucks. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the first helicopter appeared. Its low, rhythmic thrum sent a shiver down Christopher's spine as it descended onto the gleaming new helipad. The rotors kicked up a storm of dust and debris, obscuring the activity below for a few moments. When the dust settled, Christopher saw men in dark clothing moving quickly, unloading large, unmarked crates from the helicopter and transferring them to the waiting trucks. The cameras caught everything. Garrett, stationed nearby with his high-range camera, captured detailed footage of the crates and the hurried activity. He zoomed in on the side of one of the crates, catching a faint label stenciled in black: "Hazardous materials, handle with caution." "This is it," Garrett muttered over the comms to Christopher, who was watching from his living room. "We've got enough to go to the authorities." But before they could act, another helicopter appeared, its larger frame and more imposing design, suggesting it wasn't part of the HOA's usual operations. As it landed, a group of men in suits stepped out, their presence clearly commanding. Sloan greeted them nervously, his usual smug confidence replaced by something closer to fear. Garrett's voice came through again. "That's not local. These guys are big players. We need to get this footage out now." But just as Garrett began packing up his equipment to leave, a sharp, mechanical screech pierced the air. One of the cameras positioned near the helipad had been discovered by one of Sloane's men. The worker held it up, shouting to Sloane, who immediately whipped his head around, scanning the perimeter. Christopher's stomach sank as he realized what was about to happen. Within minutes, several of Sloane's men began fanning out from the helipad, flashlights cutting through the dark as they searched the area. One of them moved dangerously close to Garrett's position, forcing the investigator to retreat deeper into the woods. "They're looking for us," Garrett whispered over the comms. "Stay inside and lock your doors." But Christopher couldn't just sit back. He grabbed his phone and dialed Lisa, quickly explaining the situation. "They found one of the cameras," he said. "We've got the footage, but they're searching the area. If they find Garrett—" Lisa's voice was firm. "I'm calling the police now. You need to hold tight until they get there." Minutes felt like hours as Christopher waited, his eyes fixed on the surveillance feed from the remaining cameras. He watched as Sloane's men became increasingly frantic, their flashlights darting through the trees. One of the trucks at the helipad began to pull away, its driver clearly trying to leave before things got more chaotic. Then, in a moment that felt like slow motion, Christopher saw Garrett's face flash across one of the camera feeds as he tried to make his way back to the main road. One of Sloane's men spotted him, shouting to the others. A chase began, with Garrett weaving through the trees as the men closed in. Christopher acted on instinct. Grabbing his flashlight and an old bat he kept in the garage, he bolted out of the house and into the woods, his adrenaline drowning out any fear. He knew the terrain better than anyone and quickly intercepted Garrett, pulling him into a dense thicket just as Sloane's men reached the area. They crouched in silence as the men passed by, their flashlights casting eerie beams through the trees. When the coast was clear, Christopher and Garrett made a break for it, finally reaching the edge of the property where Garrett's car was parked. Moments later, the sound of sirens filled the air. The police arrived in force, their cars blocking the entrance to the helipad as officers poured out, weapons drawn. Sloane's men scattered, but it was too late. The trucks, the crates, and the helicopters were all still there, undeniable evidence of illegal activity. Christopher and Garrett handed over the footage, and within hours, federal agents were involved. The operation Sloane had been running was exposed as part of a larger smuggling ring, using the HOA and the helipad as a front for transporting hazardous and restricted materials. Sloane and several members of the HOA board were arrested on the spot, their carefully constructed facade fumbling in the face of overwhelming evidence. As the helicopters were impounded and the crates seized, Christopher felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't over yet. There would be court battles, investigations, and fallout to deal with. But for the first time in weeks, Christopher knew he had won the fight. The helipad would never see a single official use, and the HOA's reign of terror had come to an end. The morning after the arrests, Christopher stood on his back porch, staring at the now abandoned helipad. The area was eerily quiet, the hum of machinery and constant foot traffic replaced by a stillness that felt almost unnatural. Yellow police tape fluttered in the breeze, cordoning off the site as federal investigators worked to dismantle the remnants of the smuggling operation. For the first time in weeks, Christopher felt like he could breathe again. The fallout from the raid had been swift and far-reaching. Martin Sloane and several members of the HOA board had been taken into custody, charged with fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to smuggle hazardous materials. The federal agents had uncovered years' worth of shady dealings, with the HOA acting as a front to launder money and facilitate illegal shipments. Sloane's personal accounts were frozen, revealing substantial kickbacks tied to the construction of the helipad and other so-called community projects. The neighborhood buzzed with shock and whispers. Many residents, long intimidated by the HOA, had no idea how deeply corrupt the organization had become. As the news spread, neighbors began approaching Christopher, some offering apologies for their silence, others sharing stories of how they, too, had been bullied by Sloane and his cronies. It became clear that the HOA's reign of fear had extended far beyond Christopher's property. Marjorie was one of the first to visit him. She brought over a plate of cookies, her hands trembling slightly as she set them on the table. "I'm sorry I didn't say more earlier," she said quietly. "I was scared. We all were. But you stood up to them. You didn't back down. And now they're gone." Christopher gave her a small smile. "It wasn't just me. Lisa and Garrett, the investigators, they were a big part of this. And the police. I just couldn't let them win." Marjorie nodded, her eyes misty. "Well, you did something none of us could. Thank you, Christopher. For all of us." In the following weeks, the neighborhood began to change. The federal investigation resulted in the dissolution of the HOA's board, and a new, temporary leadership committee was put in place under close scrutiny. The board's bylaws were thoroughly reviewed, and several of the more predatory clauses, like the one that allowed for property seizure over fines, were struck down entirely. Lisa, who had continued to work tirelessly on Christopher's behalf, informed him that the fraudulent amendment to his deed had been officially nullified. His property was his again, free from the shadow of the HOA's corruption. The helipad would be demolished, and Christopher had been granted compensation from Sloan's seized assets to repair the damage done to his land. One sunny Saturday, Christopher decided to host a barbecue in his backyard. It wasn't his usual style, but after everything that had happened, he wanted to bring the neighbors together, to remind them that they weren't alone. To his surprise, almost the entire neighborhood showed up. Families brought side dishes, kids played on the lawn, and for the first time in years, the community felt united. During the barbecue, Lisa stopped by, carrying a folder under her arm. "Thought you'd like to see this," she said, handing it to Christopher. He opened it to find the final report from the investigation. It detailed the extent of Sloan's corruption, the evidence that had been gathered, and a list of properties where similar schemes had been attempted. Christopher scanned the document, shaking his head in disbelief. All this just so they could make a quick buck. Lisa nodded. They thought they could get away with it because no one would stand up to them. But you proved them wrong. You gave these people a reason to fight back. Christopher looked out at his yard, now filled with laughter and conversation. It wasn't just his fight anymore, it was theirs, too. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt a sense of peace. As the sun began to set, one of the neighbors raised a glass and a toast. "To Christopher," he said, his voice loud and clear, "for showing us that even the biggest bullies can be beaten." The crowd cheered, and Christopher felt a flush of pride. He didn't need recognition, but it felt good to know that his actions had made a difference. As the evening wore on, and the stars began to dot the sky, Christopher sat by the fire pit he had finally had time to build, watching the flames flicker. The helipad was gone. The HOA's grip on the neighborhood was broken, and his home, his sanctuary, was his again. Christopher knew the fight had changed him. It had tested his patience, his resolve, and his courage, but it had also given him something he hadn't expected, a renewed sense of community and the realization that even the most entrenched systems of power could be dismantled with enough determination. Tomorrow, he'd start replanting the grass where the helipad had been. For now, though, he let himself relax, listening to the crackle of the fire and the hum of voices around him, knowing that the worst was finally behind him.